What if I told you one of the most powerful empires in human history did not fall because of an enemy at its borders, but because of something much more dangerous inside its own throne? A silence before the storm. An empire that ruled 3 continents, that controlled the Mediterranean, the Middle East, and the gates of Europe. That made kings tremble and empires kneel. But every empire has a shadow, and the Ottoman Empire's shadow was longer than its light. From a tiny nomadic tribe on the edge of a dying world, to the walls of Constantinople shaking under cannon fire, to the golden age of Suleiman, and finally, to the slow decay of a giant that forgot how to move forward. This is not just history. This is the story of power at its absolute peak and its inevitable collapse. This is the entire history of the Ottoman Empire. They were once just a small frontier tribe on the edge of collapsing empires. Yet within a few centuries, they would reshape the destiny of 3 continents. Today, we enter the rise of the Ottoman Empire. Episode 1. How a tiny tribe built an empire. From dust and uncertainty to unstoppable conquest, this is the beginning of one of history's most astonishing power shifts. Betrayal, ambition, faith, and brutal strategy collide as a forgotten tribe begins its rise toward world dominance. Stay with this series, because this is not just history, it's the rise and fall of an empire that changed everything. Chapter 1. The Ashes of a Collapsing World. Before empires are born, the world must first learn how to fall apart. In the late 13th century, the land of Anatolia did not look like the beginning of a legend. It looked like the aftermath of one. Kingdoms once feared across continents were now reduced to broken borders, abandoned cities, and rulers arguing over scraps like starving dogs around a dead feast. To the west, the remnants of the Byzantine Empire still claimed to be an empire. But in reality, it was a shadow wearing a crown it could no longer afford. Constantinople, once the heart of civilization, now flickered like a dying flame surrounded by darkness. Walls still stood, yes, but walls do not rule empires. People do, and people were leaving. Villages emptied overnight, farmers turned into refugees, soldiers became mercenaries for whoever paid in bread instead of promises. The old order was not defeated in one glorious battle. It was rotting from the inside, slowly, humiliatingly, painfully. To the east, the echo of the Mongol storm still lingered. Cities that had once been proud centers of trade now carried names spoken only in whispers. Entire dynasties had been erased so completely that even their enemies forgot they existed. And in between all of this chaos, Anatolia, a fractured land of small Turkish beyliks, tiny principalities competing not for greatness, but for survival. Each one suspicious of the other, each one too weak to dominate, yet too proud to disappear. It was the kind of place where history does not announce itself with trumpets, but with silence. And silence, in this era, was dangerous. One wrong alliance, one failed raid, one harsh winter, and a beylik could vanish before anyone bothered to record its name correctly. Funny thing about collapsing civilizations, everyone thinks the end will be dramatic. Fire, thunder, divine punishment. But most of the time, it's just paperwork not getting done, soldiers not getting paid, and leaders arguing about who forgot to bring bread. Even the Byzantines, once Rome's greatest inheritance, were now reduced to playing political chess with pieces they no longer controlled. Sometimes they won a small negotiation, sometimes they lost an entire province. It was like watching a giant slowly forget how to stand. And yet, amid this decay, something strange was happening. Because collapse does not just destroy power, it redistributes it. When the center weakens, the edges begin to breathe. Deep in the frontier zones of northwestern Anatolia, where borders shifted faster than seasons, small warrior groups began to rise, not because they were destined to rule, but because there was no one strong enough left to stop them. One of those groups would soon be called Ottomans. But for now, they were nothing more than one among many. A name not yet feared, a banner not yet recognized, a tribe standing in the ashes of a world that had already forgotten how to hold itself together. And history, quiet, patient, almost amused, was watching closely. Because when empires collapse this completely, something new is always about to be born. Chapter 2: A small tribe on the edge. They did not look like the beginning of an empire. They looked like survivors who had simply refused to disappear. In the fractured frontier lands of northwestern Anatolia, where the borders of the dying world blurred like ink in rainwater, lived a small Turkish warrior group, later known as the Ottoman Empire in its earliest form. But at this moment in history, that name meant nothing. No flags of destiny, no golden thrones, just cold nights, uncertain mornings, and the constant question of whether tomorrow would arrive peacefully or at all. This was not a kingdom. It was a border existence, and borders are where rules go to die. The tribe moved like shadows between stronger neighbors, too small to threaten, too stubborn to vanish. They did not control vast cities or wealthy ports. Instead, they controlled something far more dangerous in unstable times: mobility, discipline, and a willingness to fight for every inch of survival. Their settlements were modest: wood, mud, and firelight. At night, the wind carried more wolves than songs. Children grew up learning the difference between a distant horn and a nearby raid. And every adult knew one truth: peace was temporary, but vigilance was permanent. Still, life continued. There was humor too, strange, rough humor shaped by hardship. Warriors argued over the best horse as if it were a sacred debate. One man swore his goat was strategically more intelligent than his neighbor's cousin. Nobody fully agreed, but nobody fully denied it either. In a world this unstable, even jokes carried the weight of survival. Yet beneath the laughter was something sharper: ambition. Not the polished ambition of courts and palaces, but the raw kind that grows in places where everything is scarce: land, safety, certainty, even memory. Here, people did not dream of luxury. They dreamed of continuity, of not being erased like so many others before them. And that is what made them dangerous. Because empires are not born from comfort. They are born from pressure. To the west, weakened Byzantine outposts watched them carefully. To the east, rival Turkish beyliks considered them insignificant. An irritation at best, a future casualty at worst. Nobody imagined that this small group on the edge of the world map could ever become anything more than a footnote. But history often hides its loudest revolutions inside quiet corners. Leadership within the tribe was not defined by crowns or ceremonies. It was defined by trust earned in raids, loyalty proven in hunger, and decisions made when hesitation meant death. Strength was not measured in wealth, but in who still stood after the chaos passed. And in that harsh selection process, a new identity began to form, slowly, almost invisibly. Not yet an empire, not yet a state, but something in between, a living instinct to expand or vanish. One evening, as the sun dropped behind the jagged Anatolian hills, a group of riders returned from a small skirmish, dust-covered, exhausted, yet strangely calm, as if violence had become just another language they spoke fluently. A child watched them from a distance and asked a simple question. Are they heroes? An older man paused, smiled faintly, and replied, No. Heroes are remembered. We are just trying not to be forgotten. That line hung in the air longer than the sun set itself, because in that moment, without realizing it, the tribe had already crossed an invisible line, from mere survival into the early shape of expansion. And somewhere beyond those hills, unseen and unaware, the future was already adjusting its direction. Chapter 3: Osman's vision begins. Some leaders inherit a throne, others inherit nothing, and still decide to build one from dust. In the unstable frontier world of northwestern Anatolia, where survival itself felt like a daily negotiation with death, a young warrior named Osman stepped forward, not with an empire behind him, but with a question no one else dared to ask. What if we stop running and start expanding? At first, nobody laughed openly. That would have been rude. But silence has its own kind of laughter. This was the world of fragmented Turkish beyliks, pressured from all sides by weakening Byzantine outposts and shifting alliances. In this landscape, power was temporary, and loyalty often lasted only as long as the next meal. Yet within this chaos, Osman saw something different, not ruin, opportunity. While others focused on defending their small territories, Osman began thinking in larger shapes, roots, not walls, momentum, not borders. He understood something most warlords ignored. In collapsing systems, speed matters more than strength. He was not the loudest leader, not the richest, not even the most feared, but he was consistent. And consistency in unstable times becomes a form of power. Stories about him spread slowly at first, like fire learning how to breathe. A small victory here, a bold raid there. Nothing dramatic enough to reshape the world, yet, but enough to make neighbors uncomfortable. One rival reportedly dismissed him by saying, "He is just a frontier rider with too much confidence." To which another replied, "That is exactly how storms begin." Osman's early campaigns were not grand invasions. They were precise, almost surgical strikes against weak frontier positions. He targeted instability the way others targeted wealth. If a region was divided, he did not wait for it to heal. He stepped into the fracture. And strangely, people began to follow him. Not because he promised riches. He didn't. Not because he promised safety. He couldn't. But because he promised direction. And in a world where everyone was drifting, direction felt like salvation. There were moments of humor, too, unexpected and human. Once, after a successful raid, one of his warriors proudly presented a captured banner as if it were a royal treasure. Osman looked at it, then at the man, and reportedly said, "Next time, bring me something we can eat." The entire group laughed. Even Osman. That laughter mattered more than it seemed, because it revealed something rare in frontier warfare: unity without ceremony, loyalty without luxury. Still, not everyone was convinced. Some elders warned that Osman was provoking forces far larger than their fragile tribe could handle. "The Byzantines will respond," they said. "The neighboring beyliks will not tolerate this." Osman's answer was simple: If we wait for permission, we will disappear politely. It was not a speech designed for history books, but it was the kind of statement that changes behavior, and behavior over time changes destiny. As seasons shifted, Osman's influence began to stretch beyond his immediate circle. Small villages started aligning with him, not out of ideology, but out of calculation. Protection, even uncertain protection, was better than none. And slowly, almost imperceptibly, something new formed around him. Not a kingdom, not yet an empire, but a gravitational pull, a center where scattered pieces of a broken frontier began to drift together. The world still did not notice, but the edge of history had already begun to tilt. Chapter 4: The First Conquests. It didn't begin with a declaration of war. It began with a village that refused to stay untouched. In the fragile frontier world of northwestern Anatolia, power was never taken in one dramatic moment. It was taken piece by piece, like pulling threads from a fabric already tearing at the seams. And now, Osman's men were no longer just surviving the chaos. They were learning how to shape it. The early expansion of what would become the Ottoman Empire did not look like an empire's rise. It looked like a series of calculated interruptions. A raid here, a fortified post there, a sudden strike against an overstretched Byzantine frontier settlement that assumed nobody would dare challenge it. That assumption was the first mistake. The weakening western territories of the Byzantine Empire were still dangerous on paper, names with history, banners with legacy. But in reality, their reach had become inconsistent. Some outposts were well defended, others were held together by exhausted soldiers and hope that had long since expired. Osman did not attack strength, he attacked fatigue. His strategy was simple, almost brutally logical. Find the weakest point, strike quickly, disappear before a response could form. It was not war as glory, it was war as timing. And it worked. The first captured settlements were small, almost insignificant in isolation. A watchtower, a trade route checkpoint, a village that changed allegiance faster than its own leaders could decide what loyalty meant. But something strange began happening after each victory. People stayed. Normally, frontier populations would flee after a raid, expecting retaliation, destruction, chaos. But under Osman's control, something unexpected occurred. Stability after conquest. Not peace in the ideal sense, but predictability. And in this era, predictability was more valuable than gold. One captured villager reportedly said, "They came like wolves, but they didn't burn the forest." That sentence spread faster than any military order. Of course, not every conquest was smooth. There were losses, ambushes, failed attempts where Osman's forces had to retreat under pressure, laughing nervously afterward, as if to convince themselves they were not just narrowly surviving disaster. One warrior, after losing his horse in a chaotic skirmish, reportedly complained, "If I lose another horse this month, I will start charging for walking services." Even Osman, usually composed, allowed moments of humor to diffuse tension. It wasn't weakness, it was control. In unstable groups, morale is as important as momentum, but behind the humor was discipline. And behind discipline was intent. Each successful raid expanded not just territory, but reputation. Neighboring beyliks began to reconsider their earlier dismissal. What once looked like a minor frontier nuisance was beginning to behave like something else entirely. A force that did not seek approval to exist. and that change in perception was dangerous. Because in fragmented political systems, perception often precedes power. One small fortress, previously ignored by larger authorities, was taken after a short but decisive engagement. The defenders expected brutality. Instead, they found negotiation. Some were integrated, others released, a few sworn into service. It was not mercy, it was strategy. Osman understood something his rivals did not. Conquest is cheaper when the conquered can still recognize themselves afterward. By the end of this phase, something irreversible had begun. The scattered pieces of frontier life were no longer drifting randomly. They were aligning slowly, unevenly, around a growing center of influence. Not yet an empire, not yet even a stable state, but a pattern was forming, and patterns once visible are very hard to stop. Chapter 5: Faith, War, and Opportunity. What if faith was not just belief, but a weapon that could move armies? In the fractured frontier world where Osman and his followers operated, war was never just about land. It was about meaning. And meaning, more than steel or numbers, was what separated survival from expansion. As the early formation of the Ottoman Empire continued to take shape, something deeper began to define its identity. Not just raids, not just victories, but a powerful fusion of faith, warfare, and opportunity. This was not an empire built in isolation. It rose in the shadow of collapsing structures, particularly the weakening authority of the Byzantine Empire. And in that vacuum, ideology became as important as strategy. At the heart of Osman's expanding influence was the concept of Gaza, holy struggle. But in practice, it was more than theology. It became motivation, recruitment, justification, and morale, all wrapped into one powerful narrative. For young warriors, it offered purpose beyond survival. For leaders, it offered legitimacy beyond tribal loyalty. And for a fragmented frontier society, it offered something dangerously powerful: unity. Not everyone interpreted it the same way, of course. Some saw it as divine duty. Others saw it as a convenient banner under which raids could be justified. And a few, quietly, simply saw opportunity, because opportunity rarely cares what name it is given. One of Osman's commanders reportedly said after a successful raid, "We fight for faith." Another replied, wiping dust from his armor, "And for better horses." No one argued, because in truth, both were correct. This blending of conviction and practicality became one of the most defining characteristics of the early Ottoman rise. It allowed them to recruit fighters from different motivations and still move in the same direction. And movement in this era was everything. But faith alone does not win battles. Timing does. Osman's forces became increasingly skilled at recognizing instability in neighboring regions. A weakened Byzantine outpost? Pressure it. A divided rival Beylik? Absorb its fighters. A trade route left unprotected? Control it before anyone else notices. They did not wait for perfect conditions. They created advantage from imperfect ones. This approach led to moments of sudden expansion that shocked surrounding powers. One day a region was neutral, the next it had shifted allegiance. Not through large-scale conquest, but through a series of small, decisive actions that accumulated like falling stones, triggering an avalanche. Still, life on the frontier remained unpredictable and often absurd. During one campaign, a supply shortage led to a heated argument over the distribution of bread. A warrior famously declared, If I die here, tell my family I died for honor, and also for the last loaf." The incident became a running joke in the camp, repeated even during serious strategic meetings, much to the frustration of senior commanders. Yet even humor served a purpose. It kept fear from settling too deeply, because fear, if left unchecked, can paralyze even the strongest force. And Osman understood this better than most. He did not rule through fear alone. He balanced it with belief. He did not demand blind obedience. He built a shared narrative where each individual felt part of something expanding beyond them. That narrative was simple. We are not the strongest, we are not the richest, but we are moving, while others are still deciding. And in a collapsing world, movement is victory. As seasons changed again, the frontier no longer felt like a place of survival. It felt like a place of transformation. The idea of a tribe on the edge was slowly becoming outdated. Something larger was forming in its place, something that others would soon be forced to recognize, whether they were ready or not. Chapter 6: The Collapse of Neighbors. Empires rarely fall because one enemy is stronger. They fall because everyone around them becomes slightly weaker at the same time. In the shifting frontier landscape where Osman's influence was growing, the rise of the early Ottoman Empire was not only a story of ambition, it was also a story of collapse happening everywhere else at once. To the west, the once mighty Byzantine Empire was no longer a unified force. It had become a collection of exhausted territories, fragmented leadership, and disconnected strongholds that struggled to coordinate even basic defense. Messages arrived too late. Reinforcements came too few, and trust between commanders was often weaker than the walls they were supposed to defend. But Byzantium was not alone in its decline. Across Anatolia, rival Turkish beyliks, once independent and competitive, were now locked in cycles of internal disputes. Brothers fought brothers over inheritance. Leaders spent more time watching their allies than their enemies. And entire factions would collapse not from invasion, but from mistrust. It was not one great war that reshaped the region. It was many small failures happening simultaneously, and Osman watched all of it carefully, because collapse, to him, was not chaos. It was opportunity becoming visible. He did not need to conquer strong kingdoms. He only needed to step into spaces where authority had already begun to evaporate. A village without protection, a trade route without enforcement, a border without agreement. And once entered, those spaces rarely returned to their previous owners. One neighboring beylik reportedly dismissed Osman's growing influence with confidence. "They are just raiders with ambition," their leader said. A month later, half of his commanders had quietly aligned themselves with Osman after a dispute over unpaid soldiers. Ambition, it turned out, was less dangerous than unpaid salaries. Even Byzantium, despite its remaining prestige, could not respond consistently. Some regions negotiated temporary peace, others broke away entirely. A few simply stopped acknowledging central authority altogether, an administrative silence more powerful than any army. And in that silence, Osman expanded, not always through direct confrontation, sometimes through alliances, sometimes through absorption, sometimes through sheer presence, arriving at the right moment when a local power structure had already cracked beyond repair. But what made this phase particularly striking was how quickly loyalty shifted. A commander who defended one banner in the morning might serve a different one by evening, not out of betrayal, but out of necessity. Survival had become more persuasive than tradition. There was even a running joke among frontier fighters. If your lord doesn't pay you, congratulations, you have just discovered a new empire. Laughter, however, never erased the seriousness underneath, because each shift of allegiance meant something larger was stabilizing in the background. Osman's forces were no longer just reacting to collapse, they were synchronizing with it. As neighboring structures weakened, his network grew stronger, not because he destroyed them all, but because he absorbed the spaces they left behind. And those spaces were multiplying. Trade routes changed hands. Small forts changed command. Entire regions began to assume new leadership structures without formal announcements. It was governance by momentum rather than decree. Still, Osman did not declare greatness. He did not need to. Greatness at this stage was not announced. It was recognized. And recognition was beginning to spread. Across Anatolia, a pattern was becoming impossible to ignore. Wherever neighboring powers weakened, Osman's influence appeared, not as a storm, but as a constant presence filling the voids left behind. And in history, nothing grows faster than something that learns how to live inside collapse itself. Chapter 7. From Tribe to State. Empires are not born when people decide to rule. They are born when people stop asking permission to survive. By this stage in the frontier world of northwestern Anatolia, the transformation of the early Ottoman Empire was no longer just visible. It was structural. What began as a small tribal force under Osman had begun to behave like something far more complex than a raiding group or frontier alliance. It was becoming a system. And systems, unlike tribes, do not disappear easily. In the past, leadership had been personal. Decisions were made face to face, loyalty was earned through proximity, and authority traveled no farther than the speed of a horse. But now, something changed. Messages began to carry authority beyond the moment they were spoken. Command structures became more consistent. Small administrative practices emerged: tax collection in controlled regions, distribution of resources after campaigns, and the formal recognition of loyal fighters. It was not bureaucracy in the later imperial sense, but it was the beginning of it. Even the perception of Osman's leadership shifted. He was no longer seen as just a successful frontier commander. He was becoming the center of an expanding gravitational field, one that pulled villages, fighters, and small communities into a shared orbit. To the west, the weakening Byzantine Empire could no longer treat this development as a minor disturbance. Reports from frontier zones increasingly described a structured force rather than scattered raiders. That distinction mattered because raids could be endured, structures had to be answered. Within Osman's growing domain, organization began to replace improvisation. Fighters were grouped more systematically, responsibilities were distributed, local leaders were integrated into a broader chain of command, not erased, but absorbed into a larger identity. And with that came stability. Not peace, but predictability. For many communities, this was a revelation. For years, they had lived under constant uncertainty, changing allegiances, inconsistent protection, unpredictable taxation from multiple competing forces. Now, under Osman's expanding influence, there was at least clarity. They knew who arrived, they knew who collected, they knew who defended. Clarity in unstable worlds feels like safety. One elder reportedly said, "I do not know if they are good, but at least they are one." That sentence captured the moment perfectly. Unity was replacing fragmentation. Of course, not everything became formal overnight. The frontier still retained its rough edges. Warriors still argued loudly over strategy. Supply shortages still caused absurd disputes. At one point, a group reportedly miscounted grain stores and temporarily believed they had enough food for a month, only to discover they had calculated optimism instead of inventory, as one commander jokingly admitted. Even Osman is said to have laughed at that, though he also ensured the responsible clerk was quietly reassigned. Humor remained part of survival, but discipline was becoming the backbone. And beneath all of it, a deeper psychological shift was taking place. People were no longer asking, "Who protects us today?" They were beginning to ask, "What are we becoming?" That question marked the transition from tribe to state, because tribes endure by adapting to surroundings. States endure by shaping them. Osman's leadership, once defined by raids and reaction, was now defined by continuity. His influence extended beyond immediate victories into long-term coordination. The idea of permanence, once almost laughable in this volatile region, was slowly becoming plausible. And as that idea took root, something irreversible formed in the background. Not just loyalty, not just expansion, but identity. A shared understanding that they were no longer just surviving history. They were beginning to write it. Chapter 8: The Spark of an Empire. It doesn't feel like history when it begins. It feels like routine. Until suddenly, nothing is routine anymore. In the frontier lands where the early Ottoman Empire had slowly evolved from scattered tribal survival into structured authority, something subtle but irreversible was happening. Not a coronation, not a declaration, but a shift in gravity. For years, Osman's growing domain had been defined by expansion through instability, absorbing weakened territories, responding to collapsing neighbors, and turning chaos into structure. But now, the pattern changed. The system no longer simply reacted to the world around it. It influenced it. To the west, the remnants of the Byzantine Empire still existed, but increasingly as a fragmented presence rather than a unified force. Frontier governors reported not just raids, but coordinated governance emerging across formerly unstable zones. That was new. That was alarming. Because raiders disappear, systems remain. Within Osman's expanding sphere, the signs of permanence multiplied. Local leaders were no longer temporary allies. They were becoming integrated parts of a larger identity. Resource flow became predictable. Military response times shortened. Communication, once fragmented and delayed, now moved with intention. It was no longer just leadership. It was structure learning how to think. And yet, from the outside, it still didn't look like an empire. No marble capitals, no imperial ceremonies, no grand declarations etched into stone. Instead, camps that stayed in place longer than expected. Villages that stopped changing allegiance every season. Fighters who no longer saw themselves as separate groups, but part of a shared direction. Direction was the key word. Because in collapsing regions, direction matters more than size. There were moments of humor even in this growing seriousness. During one administrative dispute over resources, a young officer argued the system was perfect except for humans. Another replied, "Then we are doing extremely well, considering the management problem. The argument ended in reluctant laughter and a revised ledger. These moments mattered more than they appeared. They showed discipline and humanity still coexisting inside the structure. But beneath the surface, something deeper formed: identity. People were no longer just fighting for protection or profit. They were beginning to see continuity between themselves and the system they served. A shared expectation that tomorrow would resemble today. Not chaos, but order. That was the spark. Not conquest, not wealth, but continuity. Osman himself did not announce a new age. He did not need to. Empires do not begin when leaders declare them. They begin when enough people stop imagining life without them. And that moment had arrived. From scattered frontier survival to structured expansion to something resembling permanence, the transformation crossed a threshold that could not be reversed. What had started as a small tribe on the edge of a collapsing world was no longer defined by its edges. It was beginning to define the world around it. And somewhere in that quiet transformation, history had already taken a new direction. The walls of Constantinople had stood for nearly 1,000 years. They had survived Vikings, Persians, Arabs, Crusaders, and countless sieges that shattered entire empires. People believed the city was chosen by God itself, untouchable, eternal. But in the spring of 1453, something changed. Across the horizon, a 21-year-old Ottoman sultan arrived with an army unlike anything Europe had ever seen. Behind him came giant cannons capable of shaking stone walls that had protected the city for centuries. For 53 days, the ancient capital of the Byzantine Empire resisted. Then, before sunrise on May 29th, the impossible happened. Constantinople fell. But the real story is far darker than a simple military victory, because this was not only the destruction of a city, it was the death of the medieval world. And what happened during those final nights inside the walls, betrayal, desperation, prophecy, and fear, would change history forever. So how did the world's most legendary city finally collapse? And was it doomed long before the Ottomans ever arrived? Chapter 1. The city believed to be unbreakable. Some cities are protected by walls, but Constantinople was protected by belief. For nearly 1,000 years, this city stood like a living myth at the edge of two worlds, Europe and Asia. Travelers who saw it from the sea described it as something unreal. Golden domes rising above marble walls, towers reflecting sunlight like fire, and harbors filled with ships from every known civilization. But its true power was not beauty. It was survival. Empires rose and fell around it. Armies came and disappeared into its shadow. The Persians tried. The Arabs tried. Even the mighty Crusaders once turned their swords toward its gates. Yet every time, Constantinople endured. People began to believe something deeper than politics or war. They believed the city was chosen by God. A divine shield surrounded it. A curse waited for anyone who dared to break its walls. Inside those walls lived a tired empire, the Byzantines. Once rulers of half the known world, now reduced to a fragile remnant of their former glory. Their palaces still carried gold, but their treasury was empty. Their army still carried pride, but not enough soldiers. Yet life continued. Merchants still shouted in crowded streets. Priests still lit candles inside Hagia Sophia. Children still played near the ancient walls, unaware that they were standing on the edge of history. And the walls themselves, They had become more than stone. They were identity, memory, security, hope. But outside those walls, time was changing. To the east, a young Ottoman sultan named Mehmed was rising, ambitious, disciplined, and obsessed with one idea that haunted him day and night. If Constantinople falls, history changes. Back inside the city, few truly believed that day would ever come. The walls had never failed them before, so why would they fail now? But belief, no matter how strong, cannot stop a new kind of war from arriving. And in the distance, something was already moving toward the city, something the Byzantines had never faced before. Chapter 2: The Young Sultan with an Obsession. History is not only shaped by empires, sometimes it is shaped by the obsession of a single young mind. When Mehmed II was only a teenager, he was already carrying a burden that even grown kings would fear to speak aloud. He was not just a prince of the Ottoman dynasty. He was the heir to a rising storm, a kingdom that had been expanding across continents, swallowing territories, and rewriting the map of the medieval world. But Mehmed was different. Where others saw expansion, he saw destiny. And at the center of that destiny stood one city, Constantinople. From a young age, he heard stories about it, not just as a strategic prize, but as a symbol, the final key, the gate between worlds, the city that once resisted every great power in history. To Mehmed, it became more than ambition. It became obsession. He reportedly studied maps of the city late into the night, tracing its walls, its harbors, its weak points. While others saw an impossible fortress, he saw a puzzle waiting to be solved. But obsession alone does not conquer cities. So Mehmed began preparing for something the world had never seen before. He ordered the construction of massive cannons, weapons so powerful they could shake entire walls with a single blast. Engineers from across regions were gathered, tested, pushed beyond limits. Some of them failed, some of them left. But Mehmed did not stop. He rebuilt his army into a machine of discipline, not just warriors, but engineers, artillery units, naval forces, all synchronized under a single vision. Even his enemies underestimated him. They saw a young ruler. They did not see patience. They did not see calculation. They did not see the silence before the storm. Inside his court, people whispered, "Why such focus on one city? Why risk so much for something so heavily defended?" But Mehmed never wavered. Because in his mind, Constantinople was not just a conquest. It was a turning point in history. And slowly, quietly, without the world fully realizing it, the war machine was already moving. Chapter 3: The Siege That Shocked the World. Warfare had existed for centuries, but nothing prepared Constantinople for what came next. When the Ottoman army finally surrounded the city in 1453, it did not look like a normal siege. It looked like the world itself was closing in. At first, the Byzantines believed they could endure it, as they had done so many times before. The walls were strong, the sea still offered hope, and inside the city, faith had always been their strongest weapon. But this time, something was different. The first shock came with the cannons. Massive iron monsters, unlike anything the medieval world had ever seen, were dragged into position. When they fired, the ground itself seemed to tremble. Stone that had stood for 1,000 years began to crack under thunder-like explosions. Each blast echoed across the city like a warning. This was not a war of patience anymore. It was a war of destruction. Day after day, the walls were punished, not broken instantly, but slowly worn down. Like even immortality can eventually weaken under relentless force. Then came the blockade. Ottoman ships sealed the harbor, cutting Constantinople off from the sea, its lifeline for food, trade, and reinforcements. The city that once controlled the waters of 2 continents was now trapped inside its own legend. But Mehmed's strategy did not stop there. In one of the most unexpected maneuvers in military history, Ottoman ships were dragged across land, over hills and rough terrain, to bypass the massive chain blocking the Golden Horn. When the Byzantine defenders saw ships suddenly appearing where water should not exist, panic spread faster than fire. It was no longer just siege warfare, it was psychological collapse. Inside the city, fear began to grow quietly at first, then loudly, then uncontrollably. Food became scarce. Churches were filled not just with prayers, but with desperation. Soldiers stood on the walls, watching dust clouds rise from the Ottoman cannons, wondering how long stone could continue to defend human hope. And yet, they still held on, because to abandon the walls was to abandon everything they believed they were. But every night, as the explosions echoed in the distance, one truth became harder to ignore. This siege was not like the others, and for the first time in 1,000 years, Constantinople began to feel breakable. Chapter 4: The Final Night of Constantinople. On that night, an entire civilization held its breath, knowing sunrise might never come for them. Inside the city, silence felt heavier than the cannons outside. It was May 28th, 1453, the final night of Constantinople. In Hagia Sophia, the greatest cathedral of the Byzantine world, people gathered not as citizens of an empire, but as survivors of a fading era. Candles flickered against ancient marble walls. Icons watched silently as priests led one last mass. Men, women, soldiers, nobles, they stood together. Not separated by rank anymore, but united by fear, hope, and the quiet understanding that history was about to close a chapter that would never be written again. Some wept openly. Others whispered prayers they had not spoken in years. A few simply stood still, staring upward, as if waiting for something divine to answer back. Outside, Emperor Constantine the 11th prepared for his final stand. He was not a young conqueror. He was a ruler at the edge of extinction. Yet there was no hesitation in him, only duty. He walked along the broken walls, speaking to soldiers not as subjects, but as brothers. He knew they were outnumbered. He knew the cannons had weakened their defenses. He knew the city could no longer hold. But he stayed, because leaving was not an option for a man who had become the last symbol of an empire. As midnight passed, tension thickened across the city. Every shadow felt alive. Every sound felt like the beginning of the end. Then it happened. Before dawn, the Ottoman army launched its final assault. Wave after wave of soldiers surged forward, screaming into the night. Cannons roared. Arrows filled the sky like falling stars of destruction. The exhausted defenders rushed to the walls one last time, fighting not for victory, but for time. Inside Constantinople, people prayed louder than ever before. Outside, history was breaking through stone. And somewhere between those two worlds, the fate of an empire was being decided, second by second, breath by breath. The final night had begun its last hour. and nothing inside those walls would ever be the same again.
Reach the walls! Stop that!
Chapter 5. The Fall That Changed World History. Cities don't always fall in a day. Sometimes they fall in a single moment that reshapes centuries. Just before dawn on May 29th, 1453, Constantinople finally broke. The Ottoman forces pushed through the weakened defenses with overwhelming force. The walls that had stood for nearly 1,000 years, once believed to be eternal, could no longer hold the weight of endless cannon fire, exhaustion, and time itself. Inside the chaos, order collapsed into survival. The defenders fought desperately, but they were no longer an army of victory. They were an army of memory, holding on not because they could win, but because they could not accept losing. Emperor Constantine the 11th was seen for the last time fighting among his men. There were no grand escapes, no heroic withdrawals, only a final stand at the edge of a disappearing world. Then, silence was replaced by conquest. Ottoman soldiers poured into the city. Flags rose over broken walls. Streets that had once echoed with imperial pride now echoed with the sound of a new power taking shape. And just like that, the Byzantine Empire ended. An empire that had lasted over 1,000 years did not fade slowly. It collapsed into a single, irreversible moment, as if history itself had finally closed a long, exhausted book. Inside the city, the emotional weight was unimaginable. Families hid in churches. Soldiers laid down weapons they could no longer lift. Survivors walked through streets that no longer belonged to them. But beneath the surface of destruction, something more complex was unfolding. Because Constantinople did not only fall due to cannons or armies, it fell because time had shifted. The Byzantine world had been living in the shadow of its past glory, relying on walls, traditions, and legacy, while the world outside evolved. New military technology, unified leadership under Mehmed II, and a disciplined war machine had changed the rules entirely. The city didn't just lose a battle, it lost relevance in a changing age. And from its ruins, a new era began. Under the Ottomans, Constantinople would transform into a new capital, Istanbul, becoming a bridge between continents, cultures, and centuries. What ended in fire and fear also began something unexpected, a different world order. Because history does not stop when empires fall, it simply changes hands. And in 1453, the world quietly stepped out of one age and into another that would never look back. Empires don't truly end. They echo through time, and this is just the beginning of a much larger story. History remembers empires for the wars they win, but only a few rulers become legends powerful enough to redefine an entire civilization. In the 16th century, one man transformed the Ottoman Empire from a rising superpower into the center of the world. His armies terrified Europe, his navy ruled the seas, his laws reshaped society. And inside his palace, love, betrayal, ambition, and bloodshed silently threatened the empire he was building. To the west, he became known as Suleiman the Magnificent. To his own people, he was called Kanuni, the lawgiver. This is not just the story of a sultan. It is the story of the moment the Ottoman Empire reached the height of its glory, while the seeds of its future collapse were already being planted beneath the golden domes of Istanbul. Chapter 1: The Prince Born for an Empire. Before he became the most powerful ruler on earth, He was simply a boy growing up beneath the shadow of an unstoppable empire. At the dawn of the 16th century, the Ottoman Empire was no longer a frontier kingdom fighting for survival. It had become a machine of conquest. The walls of Constantinople had already fallen. The banners of the Ottomans stretched across 3 continents. From the Balkans to Anatolia, from the Black Sea to the deserts of the Middle East, millions now lived beneath the authority of one dynasty, the House of Othman. And inside the imperial palaces of Trabzon and Istanbul, a young prince named Suleiman was being prepared for something far greater than ordinary kingship. Born in 1494 to Sultan Selim's family, Suleiman entered a world where weakness could mean death. The Ottoman throne was not inherited peacefully like the crowns of Europe. Princes were raised to rule, but also raised knowing that brothers could become enemies overnight. Power inside the empire was absolute, and absolute power demanded absolute strength. From childhood, Suleiman studied military strategy, Islamic law, poetry, diplomacy, science, and the languages of empire. He learned how to command armies before he was old enough to lead men into battle. He listened to stories of great conquerors, Alexander, Caesar, and Mehmed the Conqueror, rulers who had reshaped history through force and vision. But Suleiman was not growing up during an age of peace. Beyond Ottoman borders, Europe was changing rapidly. Powerful kingdoms were rising. The Catholic world feared another Ottoman expansion into the heart of Europe. Trade routes, religion, and dynasties were colliding in ways that would soon ignite conflicts across continents. Then came Sultan Selim I, Suleiman's father. Known as Selim the Grim, he expanded the empire with terrifying speed, conquering Syria, Egypt, and the holy cities of Mecca and Medina. By the time Selim's campaigns ended, the Ottomans had become not only an empire, but the dominant Islamic superpower of the world. And that changed everything for Suleiman, because now the expectations were almost impossible. He was no longer expected merely to protect the empire. He was expected to surpass every ruler before him, to become greater than Mehmed, greater than Selim, perhaps even greater than Rome itself. The young prince could not yet know it, but history was already preparing him for a reign that would transform the Ottoman Empire into a legend remembered for centuries. Chapter 2: The Throne of Fire. Power is never inherited in peace inside an empire built by conquest. It is seized, defended, and paid for in blood. In 1520, the Ottoman Empire stood at its peak of expansion. Its borders stretched across continents, its armies feared from Vienna to Cairo, and its name echoed like a warning across Europe. But inside the palace walls of Istanbul, there was no celebration waiting for the new ruler, only silence and danger. Suleiman ascended the throne after the death of his father, Selim I, a ruler so ruthless and efficient that even his enemies called him the Grim. Selim had left behind not just an empire, but a system built on constant expansion, strict discipline, and zero tolerance for weakness. And now that system was in Suleiman's hands. He was only 26 years old, young, educated, thoughtful, but suddenly responsible for an empire that never paused, never rested, and never forgave mistakes. Almost immediately, cracks began to appear. In the provinces, distant governors tested their loyalty. In the military, ambitious commanders watched the new sultan carefully, waiting to see if he was strong enough to control them. Across the empire's vast territories, whispers of rebellion began to spread, not because Suleiman was weak, but because every new ruler was a moment of opportunity for chaos. And outside the empire, enemies were already moving. European kingdoms, still shocked by Ottoman dominance, began preparing for resistance. Venetian merchants feared their trade routes, Habsburg rulers feared their borders, and the Mediterranean itself was becoming a battlefield of empires. Inside Istanbul, Suleiman faced an even more dangerous reality: the palace itself. The Ottoman court was not just a seat of power, it was a battlefield of influence. Viziers, military elites, and royal factions all understood one truth: a young sultan could be shaped or destroyed. But Suleiman did not panic. Where others expected hesitation, he showed control. Where others expected fear, he showed calculation. He began consolidating authority with precision, removing potential threats quietly, reinforcing loyalty through reward and discipline, and asserting his presence not through words, but through decisions that echoed across the empire. Yet beneath the surface, the pressure was immense, because ruling the Ottoman Empire was not like ruling a kingdom. It was like holding together a storm that never stopped moving. Every decision carried consequences across continents. Every weakness could trigger rebellion. Every delay could shift the balance of power in Europe. And so, as Suleiman sat on the throne of Constantinople, he understood a brutal truth. This was not a throne of comfort. It was a throne of fire. And only those who could endure the flames could survive long enough to become legend. Chapter 3: The Conqueror of Europe. Empires are not remembered for their intentions. They are remembered for the cities they break and the worlds they reshape. When Suleiman turned his gaze toward Europe, it was not as a young ruler proving himself. It was as a sovereign who understood that power in the 16th century was measured in territory, fear, and unstoppable momentum. And Europe, at that moment, was not ready. In 1521, Suleiman made his first major move: Belgrade. A heavily fortified Christian stronghold on the frontier between East and West, long considered the key to controlling the Danube corridor. For decades, previous Ottoman rulers had failed to take it. It stood as a symbol of resistance. But Suleiman approached it differently, not with hesitation, but with preparation, not with doubt, but with precision. When Ottoman cannons finally broke the walls of Belgrade, it was not just a military victory, it was a psychological collapse for Europe. A message had been delivered. The new sultan was not here to inherit borders. He was here to erase them. Then came Rhodes in 1522, a fortified island held by the Knights of St. John, one of the most disciplined military orders in Christendom. For months, siege warfare turned the island into a battlefield of fire, stone, and exhaustion. When Rhodes finally fell, Europe understood something terrifying. Even their most elite defenders were no longer safe. But the defining moment of Suleiman's early European campaigns came in 1526, the Battle of Mohacs. In the fields of Hungary, the Ottoman army met the forces of King Louis II in a confrontation that would decide the fate of Central Europe. It was over in less than 2 hours. The Hungarian army collapsed under Ottoman artillery, cavalry coordination, and battlefield discipline. King Louis II himself died during the retreat, and with his death, a kingdom fractured into political chaos. Mohacs was not just a battle, it was a turning point in European history. Entire regions fell under Ottoman influence. Panic spread through Christian Europe, and Vienna, the heart of the Habsburg Empire, suddenly became the next anticipated target. Suleiman's reputation now extended far beyond the east. He was no longer seen as a regional threat. He was the storm approaching the center of Europe. And yet, even as his empire expanded across continents, Suleiman's strategy was not chaos. It was structure. Each conquest strengthened administration. Each victory expanded trade. Each territory became part of a carefully designed imperial system. To Europe, he was a conqueror. But inside his empire, he was building something far more enduring. A state designed not only to win wars, but to sustain power across generations. And with every fallen fortress, Suleiman was sending a silent message to the world. The age of Ottoman expansion was not ending. It was only beginning. Chapter 4: The Siege That Shook Vienna. There are moments in history when an empire does not just attack a city, it tests the limits of an entire civilization. In 1529, that moment arrived at the gates of Vienna. By then, Suleiman's name had already become a force of nature in Europe. Belgrade had fallen, Rhodes had collapsed, Mohacs had shattered a kingdom. And now, the Ottoman Empire stood at the edge of Central Europe's most symbolic stronghold, the capital of the Habsburg dynasty. Vienna was not just a city, it was a barrier, a psychological line dividing two worlds, the expanding Ottoman East and the anxious Christian West. And Suleiman intended to cross it. His army moved with immense scale. Tens of thousands of soldiers, artillery trains, engineers, and supply columns stretching across the landscape like a moving empire. This was not a raid, it was a statement of intent. But Europe had been watching. The Habsburg Emperor Charles V, already engaged in conflicts across Europe, rushed to defend Vienna. Inside the city, civilians prepared for siege, reinforcing walls, gathering supplies, and bracing for what many believed would be the final test of Christendom's survival. When the Ottoman forces arrived, Vienna entered a state of historical tension, unlike anything it had ever experienced. The thunder of cannons echoed across its fortifications. Earth shook beneath the repeated assaults. Smoke and fire turned the horizon into a constant battlefield. For weeks, the city endured relentless pressure. Ottoman engineers attempted to breach the walls. Infantry launched repeated assaults. The empire that had broken kingdoms now stood before a single fortified city that refused to fall. But war is not only decided by strength, it is decided by time. As autumn rains arrived, supply lines stretched thin, weather conditions worsened. Morale and logistics began to strain an army built for speed and conquest. Inside Vienna, defenders held on with desperation and discipline, knowing that every hour mattered. And then, something shifted. Suleiman made the decision to withdraw. It was not defeat in the traditional sense. Vienna had not been conquered, but it had not broken either. The siege ended not with celebration, but with silence. And that silence echoed across Europe louder than any victory parade. Because Vienna had survived. And in surviving, it had proven that the Ottoman Empire, despite its unstoppable reputation, still had limits. But for Suleiman, the campaign was not failure. It was a calculation. He had tested Europe at its core. He had demonstrated reach, power, and logistical dominance on an unprecedented scale. And even without capturing Vienna, he had achieved something deeper. He had made Europe understand that the Ottoman Empire was not a distant threat anymore. It was standing at their doorstep, and it could return at any time. Chapter 5: Master of the Seas. When land becomes crowded with empires, true power shifts to the water, where borders dissolve and control belongs only to those who command the waves. In Suleiman's time, the Mediterranean was not a sea of peace. It was a battlefield without walls. Every coastline was contested, every trade route was a source of wealth, and every ship carried not just goods, but the future of empires. Suleiman understood this better than any ruler in Europe. Land could be conquered slowly, but sea power determined who controlled the flow of the world itself. So he turned his attention outward, beyond the mountains of Europe and the deserts of the Middle East, toward the water that connected civilizations. At the heart of this transformation stood legendary Ottoman admirals, most notably Hayreddin Barbarossa, a naval commander whose name alone would terrify Christian fleets across the Mediterranean. Under Suleiman's authority, the Ottoman navy was not just expanded, it was redesigned into a strategic instrument of empire. Shipyards in Istanbul, Gallipoli, and North Africa operated with relentless efficiency. Warships were built faster, stronger, and in greater numbers than ever before. And then the balance of power began to shift. Venice, once the undisputed master of Mediterranean trade, started losing its dominance. Spanish fleets, powerful and ambitious under the Habsburg crown, began clashing directly with Ottoman naval forces. What had once been a Venetian lake was becoming a contested imperial highway. The most dramatic moment of this transformation came at the Battle of Preveza in 1538. There, Barbarossa's fleet faced a massive coalition of European naval powers. On paper, the Christian alliance should have overwhelmed the Ottomans, but strategy mattered more than numbers. Barbarossa used speed, positioning, and coordination with devastating precision. Ottoman ships moved like a unified organism across the water, breaking enemy formations and exploiting weaknesses in real time. By the end of the battle, Europe's naval confidence had been shattered. The Mediterranean had a new dominant force, and it was Ottoman. But Suleiman's naval expansion was not only about war, it was about economics, diplomacy, and global influence. Control of the seas meant control of trade routes stretching from North Africa to the Red Sea, from the spice markets of the East to the ports of Europe. It meant taxation, movement, and influence over civilizations far beyond the battlefield. For the first time, the Ottoman Empire was not just a land-based superpower. It had become a maritime empire, one capable of projecting power in multiple directions at once. And in that transformation, Suleiman achieved something few rulers ever manage. He turned geography itself into an advantage, from mountains to seas, from Europe to Africa, from battleships to trade winds. The Ottoman Empire under Suleiman was no longer contained by borders. It was defined by motion, dominance, and reach. Chapter 6: Love, Power, and the Harem. In empires built on conquest, the greatest wars are not always fought on battlefields. Sometimes they are fought behind palace doors, where love becomes leverage and affection becomes strategy. Inside the marble walls of Topkapi Palace, power did not rest only in armies or laws. It lived in whispers, corridors, and the unseen influence of those who had access to the Sultan himself. And in Suleiman's reign, that hidden world changed forever. It began with a woman named Hurrem Sultan. She entered the Ottoman court not as a queen, but as a slave concubine, one among many within the imperial harem. Yet what made her different was not birth or status, it was influence. Suleiman, the conqueror of Europe and master of vast armies, found himself drawn into a relationship that defied the rigid traditions of the Ottoman imperial system. For centuries, sultans did not formally marry concubines. The harem was designed for succession, not attachment. Love was not supposed to reshape politics, but history rarely respects design. Harem rose quickly, not by force, but by intelligence, persuasion, and an instinctive understanding of imperial psychology. She learned how power moved inside the palace, not through titles, but through access, not through commands, but through proximity to the sultan's decisions. And slowly, the balance of the empire began to shift. Within the palace, rival factions emerged. Viziers who once controlled influence through tradition now faced a new and unpredictable force. The harem itself became a political arena where alliances formed and collapsed in silence. Succession, always a dangerous subject in Ottoman politics, grew even more volatile. Princes were not just heirs, they were rivals in waiting. Every son represented a future shift in power. Every mother became a potential architect of that future. Paranoia settled into the imperial court like an invisible fog, and Suleiman, despite his authority, found himself ruling not just an empire, but a complex emotional and political ecosystem, where loyalty was no longer simple and truth was rarely visible. Yet this was not merely a story of manipulation, it was also a story of transformation. Hürrem Sultan became one of the most influential women in Ottoman history, involved in diplomacy, charitable foundations, and imperial correspondence. Her presence reshaped how power functioned inside the empire, blurring the line between personal relationship and political structure. But every shift in power creates tension, and within the palace, that tension grew quietly, dangerously, and inevitably. Because in the Ottoman world of Suleiman, even love was not separate from empire, it was part of it, and sometimes it was the most powerful force of all. Chapter 7: The Golden Age and the Shadow Ahead. Every empire believes its peak is permanence, until history quietly proves that even greatness carries the seeds of its own ending. By the mid-16th century, the Ottoman Empire under Suleiman had reached a scale few civilizations had ever achieved. Its borders stretched across 3 continents. Its armies dominated land campaigns from Hungary to Mesopotamia. Its navy controlled vast stretches of the Mediterranean, and its laws, administration, and culture shaped one of the most powerful states on earth. This was the Golden Age. Suleiman was no longer just a conqueror. He had become a symbol of order, justice, and imperial sophistication, known across his realm as Kanuni, the lawgiver. His legal reforms structured governance, strengthened taxation systems, and standardized imperial administration in ways that outlived military victories. But beneath the surface of this golden order, something darker was forming. Power at its peak rarely feels stable. It feels fragile. Because the higher an empire rises, the more devastating its internal fractures become. That fracture came in the form of succession. Among Suleiman's sons, one stood out: Prince Mustafa, a charismatic and highly respected heir apparent. To the army, he represented continuity. To many officials, he represented stability. To others within the palace, however, he represented risk. a shift in power that could erase existing influence networks. And inside the political machinery of the empire, perception could be more dangerous than reality. Rumors began to circulate, allegiances shifted silently, and fear slowly replaced trust at the highest levels of the court. In 1553, during a military campaign, Prince Mustafa was executed on Suleiman's orders. The event sent shockwaves through the empire. To many, it was unthinkable. The elimination of a beloved prince, a future sultan, a figure seen as the empire's next great ruler. But in the logic of imperial survival, it was framed as necessity. A decision shaped by suspicion, influence, and the unforgiving structure of Ottoman succession politics. After Mustafa's death, the emotional and political weight inside the palace deepened. Suleiman, once the unstoppable conqueror of Europe, now carried the burden of irreversible choices. The empire remained strong externally, but internally, something had changed. Time, once an ally of expansion, now became an invisible adversary. Campaigns continued. Law remained structured. The empire still projected immense power across continents. But Suleiman himself was aging, and history does not pause for even the greatest rulers. As his final years unfolded, the Ottoman Empire stood at its absolute peak, a civilization of unmatched reach and influence. Yet within that peak, the first quiet signals of future decline were already present, not in collapse, not in defeat, but in the simple, unavoidable truth that no golden age lasts forever. And as Suleiman's long reign moved toward its end, the empire he built stood like a towering monument, brilliant, powerful, and already beginning to cast a longer shadow than ever before. Empires don't fall in a single moment. They fade while still believing they are eternal. And in the story of Suleiman, even the brightest golden age was already whispering the sound of its own ending. Behind every empire that shines in history books, there is another version of the story. One written in silence, blood, and fear. The Ottoman Empire was not only a world of conquest and glory, it was also a world of hidden power struggles, silent executions, palace conspiracies, and secrets carefully buried beneath centuries of gold and marble. From the outside, it looked like order. From the inside, it was survival. Because in this empire, truth was dangerous, loyalty was conditional, and even royalty could disappear without a trace. This is the story history rarely tells. This is the empire's dark secrets. Chapter 1: The Palace of Whispered Power. Some of the most powerful decisions in history were never announced to the world. They were whispered in rooms where even silence felt dangerous. At the heart of Istanbul stood Topkapi Palace. Not just a royal residence, but the central nervous system of an empire spanning 3 continents. To outsiders, it appeared majestic. Golden domes, intricate courtyards, endless corridors of marble and tile. A symbol of order, wealth, and divine authority. But inside those walls, beauty was only the surface. Beneath it lay something far more complex. A system of controlled access, layered hierarchy, and invisible power struggles that determined the fate of millions. Because the Ottoman Empire did not function like modern states, it did not rely on public debate or transparent governance. It relied on proximity. Who stood closest to the Sultan controlled influence. Who controlled influence controlled decisions. And who controlled decisions shaped history. Inside the palace, every corridor had meaning. Every chamber had restriction. Every silence had purpose. Officials did not simply enter rooms. They passed through levels of permission, each gate separating power from the outside world. And at the center of it all was the Sultan, present yet distant, surrounded by advisors, guards, scholars, and servants, but never truly accessible. This structure created something unique, a political ecosystem where information was currency. A single message delayed or altered could shift military campaigns. A whispered suggestion could change imperial policy. A carefully placed rumor could destroy a career or save a life. Behind the formal structure of viziers and commanders existed another reality: informal networks of influence. Alliances formed quietly between court officials, palace staff, and members of the imperial household, not through public declarations, but through subtle exchanges and carefully timed interventions. Even the Sultan, despite absolute authority on paper, depended on this flow of information. What he knew, when he knew it, and who delivered it, all shaped his perception of reality. And in such an environment, truth was never pure. It was filtered, edited, reconstructed. This is what made Topkapi Palace powerful and dangerous, because empires are not only ruled by laws and armies, they are ruled by information. And inside this palace of whispered power, information was never neutral. It was a weapon. Chapter 2: The Price of Succession. In most kingdoms, a crown is inherited, but in the Ottoman Empire, it was survived. There was no rule more defining or more brutal in Ottoman political life than succession, and no system more misunderstood outside its walls. To the outside world, it looked like an empire of order, discipline, and divine legitimacy. But inside its dynastic structure, there was a silent truth everyone understood, but no one dared soften. When a sultan died, his sons did not inherit a family. They inherited a battlefield. Unlike European monarchies, where primogeniture often secured a clear line of succession, the Ottoman system left the throne open to all royal sons. No guaranteed heir, no protected future, only competition, until one survived. This system was designed to prevent civil war across the empire, but instead, it relocated the war into the palace itself. From childhood, princes were trained as governors, commanders, and administrators. They ruled provinces, led military units, and built political networks, all while knowing that every success increased their legitimacy and their danger. Because strength was not only rewarded, it was feared. Inside the imperial court, every prince represented both hope and threat. To rise too quickly meant suspicion. To remain too weak meant irrelevance. And to be too popular could mean becoming a target long before ever seeing the throne. Over time, this created a psychological structure unlike any other empire in history. Brotherhood was formal, but rivalry was inevitable. Affection existed, but survival always came first. The Sultan himself stood at the center of this tension. As both father and ruler, he carried the impossible responsibility of balancing imperial stability against dynastic destruction. And when succession moments arrived, the system revealed its most severe principle. The elimination of rivals was not an exception. It was embedded into the logic of continuity. Princes who were once groomed as future rulers could suddenly be declared threats to unity. Their popularity among soldiers, their alliances within the court, or even the perception of ambition could trigger irreversible consequences. What made this system so powerful was not just its brutality, but its predictability. Everyone understood the rules, everyone lived within them, and yet no one could escape them. Over generations, this shaped a culture where ambition carried emotional cost, where trust was conditional, and where every prince lived with an unspoken awareness that their greatest rival might not be an enemy abroad, but a brother within the same palace walls. Chapter 3: The Shadows of the Harem. What history calls luxury was, in reality, a silent battlefield where influence decided who lived in light and who disappeared into shadow. To the outside world, the imperial harem of the Ottoman Empire looked like a place of mystery and beauty. Marble halls, silk curtains, music, poetry, and guarded privacy behind palace walls. But inside, it was not a world of romance. It was a world of structure, strategy, survival. The harem was not simply a private residence. It was a political institution embedded deep within the machinery of empire. At its center stood the sultan, surrounded not only by family, but by a carefully organized hierarchy of women who held varying degrees of access, privilege, and influence. And in an empire where proximity meant power, access to the sultan became one of the most valuable resources in the entire state. This created a reality few outside the palace could truly understand. Influence in the Ottoman court was not always exercised through armies or offices. It was often shaped through conversation, timing, and emotional intelligence behind closed doors. Within the harem, alliances formed quietly, rivalries developed without public confrontation, and decisions that affected princes, viziers, and even military campaigns could begin as private conversations in secluded chambers. Every member of the harem understood an unspoken truth. Visibility was power, but invisibility could be survival. Mothers of princes became especially significant, because in the Ottoman succession system, their sons were not just children. They were future contenders for the throne. And as their sons' futures rose, so too did their own political weight within the palace ecosystem. This created a delicate and often dangerous balance. Support could elevate status, favor could shift entire alliances, and disfavor, even subtle, could signal irreversible decline in influence. Unlike formal offices of state, the harem operated through perception rather than structure. There were no public decrees, no official debates, no visible voting of power. Everything moved through suggestion, interpretation, and carefully managed access. This made it both powerful and unpredictable. Because in such an environment, truth was rarely direct. It was shaped, filtered, reframed. And those who mastered this invisible system could influence an empire without ever stepping onto a battlefield. Yet beneath the silk and silence, tension was constant. Not open conflict, but controlled pressure. A world where every smile could carry intent, every silence could carry meaning, and every moment of access to the sultan could alter the trajectory of dynasties. The harem was not outside politics, it was one of its deepest engines. And in the Ottoman Empire, even the most private spaces were never truly separate from power. Chapter 4: The Silent Blade of the Empire. In empires built for survival, justice is not always spoken. Sometimes it arrives without warning and leaves no room for appeal. Power in the Ottoman Empire was not maintained by symbolism alone. It was enforced through certainty. And behind that certainty existed one of the most feared instruments of state control in imperial history: the practice of execution as political security. To modern eyes, it appears brutal, but within the logic of the empire, it was framed as necessity, a mechanism designed to prevent fragmentation, rebellion, and civil war at a scale that could destroy continents. Because the Ottoman state was vast, diverse, and constantly expanding. Its survival depended on speed of decision-making and absolute clarity of authority. Any prolonged internal conflict risked weakening the entire structure. So the empire developed a system where threats were not debated indefinitely. They were assessed, and if deemed dangerous to stability, removed. This was not random violence. It was institutionalized control. High-ranking officials, viziers, military commanders, and provincial governors operated under a constant awareness that loyalty was not just expected, it was continuously evaluated. A shift in political alignment, a suspected conspiracy, a failure in military campaign, even rumors of disobedience. Any of these could trigger irreversible consequences. What made this system especially powerful was not just its severity, but its unpredictability. There were no public trials in many cases, no long appeals, no extended uncertainty. Decisions could be swift, quiet, final. And because outcomes were not always visible in advance, fear became an invisible layer of governance, shaping behavior long before action was ever taken. Within the court and administration, this created a culture of extreme caution. Officials learned to speak carefully, to act precisely, to avoid even the perception of disloyalty. Yet paradoxically, this system also produced stability, because ambition without control became dangerous, and unchecked power at lower levels was continuously restrained by the possibility of intervention from above. In this way, the silent blade was not only a tool of punishment, it was also a structural deterrent. It maintained equilibrium in an empire where distance between center and periphery was vast, and where communication delays could otherwise lead to fragmentation. But beneath its efficiency lay a psychological cost. Trust within the system was never absolute. Relationships were always filtered through awareness of consequence, and survival often depended not only on competence, but on perception. The Ottoman Empire did not rely solely on fear, but fear was never absent from its architecture of power. And in the silence that followed each unseen decision, the message was always the same. The empire does not hesitate to protect itself, even when no one is watching. Chapter 5: Viziers, Betrayal, and the Game of Survival. In the Ottoman court, power was never a possession. It was a temporary condition granted by trust and revoked by silence. At the highest level of the Ottoman Empire, the Sultan did not rule alone. He ruled through men who carried the weight of administration, war, diplomacy, and governance across 3 continents. The viziers. These were not ordinary advisors. They were empire builders in their own right. Grand viziers commanded armies, negotiated treaties, managed taxation systems, and governed provinces that were larger than many European kingdoms. Their authority could stretch across vast regions, making them indispensable to the functioning of the state. Yet their position contained a contradiction that defined their existence. The closer they were to power, the more exposed they became to its volatility. In theory, loyalty secured their place. In practice, loyalty was never fully measurable. Because in a system where information was filtered, alliances were private, and perception often outweighed fact. Even the most capable vizier could fall under suspicion. Political influence in the Ottoman court was not static. It shifted constantly, shaped by military outcomes, court rivalries, administrative success, and the invisible flow of palace narratives. A successful campaign could elevate a minister to extraordinary favor. A single failure, or even the perception of misjudgment, could begin a rapid decline. And once favor began to fade, it rarely returned. What made this environment particularly dangerous was not only competition, but uncertainty. No official position guaranteed safety. No achievement guaranteed permanence. Even decades of service could not fully protect against sudden political reversal. Within this system, ministers developed survival instincts that bordered on strategy itself. They built alliances carefully. They navigated court factions with precision. They balanced ambition with restraint, knowing that visibility could elevate them or expose them. Yet, despite all caution, many still fell. Some were removed quietly, without public explanation. Others were dismissed suddenly after dramatic shifts in political alignment. And some disappeared from the political landscape so quickly that their influence seemed to vanish almost overnight, leaving behind only fragmented records of their authority. This unpredictability created a defining feature of Ottoman governance. Power was not just about achieving position. It was about maintaining perception of alignment with the center. The Grand Vizier could command armies one year and be replaced the next. Provincial governors could rule vast territories and lose everything in a single decree. In this environment, betrayal was not always personal. It was structural. Because survival in the Ottoman political system was not guaranteed by strength alone. It depended on timing, trust, and the fragile balance between ambition and obedience. And so the empire continued to function. Not because its leaders were invincible, but because every powerful man within it understood a simple truth. In the game of survival, even success is temporary. Chapter 6. The Myth of Absolute Loyalty. Empires do not collapse only because enemies grow stronger. They weaken when loyalty becomes uncertain inside their own walls. In the Ottoman imagination, loyalty was treated as a pillar of stability, a sacred expectation binding soldiers, officials, and nobles to the Sultan. But inside the actual machinery of power, loyalty was far more complex. It was not a fixed value. It was a calculated condition, constantly tested, constantly interpreted, and constantly at risk of being redefined. At the highest levels of the court, no one could assume permanence. Not ministers, not generals, not even those who had served the empire for decades. Because loyalty in the Ottoman system was never judged solely by intention. It was measured through outcomes, perception, and political alignment at any given moment in time. A commander who succeeded in battle could be praised as loyal and capable one day, and questioned the next if circumstances shifted. A vizier who served faithfully could still become a liability if court narratives turned against him. And in such an environment, certainty was impossible. This uncertainty gradually reshaped behavior inside the imperial elite. Officials learned to operate not only with competence, but with caution. They avoided irreversible commitments. They monitored shifting alliances. They adjusted their public positions carefully depending on political climate. Over time, this created a subtle transformation. Trust was no longer the foundation of governance. Awareness of consequence was. Fear did not replace loyalty entirely, but it began to coexist with it. And in many cases, it became the stronger force. Because fear is immediate. Fear is clear. Fear does not require interpretation. Loyalty, on the other hand, is abstract. It requires belief, continuity, and mutual assurance, all of which are fragile in a system where power can shift without warning. This does not mean the Ottoman Empire lacked committed individuals. Many served with extraordinary dedication, discipline, and belief in imperial stability. But the system itself did not rely on certainty of loyalty. It relied on management of risk, and that distinction defined its political reality. Even at the highest level, relationships were shaped by awareness that today's ally could become tomorrow's concern, not necessarily through betrayal, but through changing political necessity. This constant tension created an empire that was highly effective, yet psychologically demanding for those inside it. Because in a world where loyalty could never be fully guaranteed, survival depended on something more pragmatic than trust, adaptation, awareness, and timing. And so, within the Ottoman court, a quiet truth endured beneath every oath and every declaration of service. Loyalty was honored in words, but survival was decided by perception. Chapter 7. When Empires Begin to Eat Themselves. The greatest danger to an empire is not the enemy at its borders, but the contradictions it carries within its own success. The Ottoman Empire, at its height, appeared almost unbreakable. Its armies were disciplined, its administration highly structured, and its territorial reach unmatched across continents. To external observers, it looked like a perfectly engineered system of power, expanding, adapting, and dominating with consistent precision. But inside that system, tension was accumulating in ways that could not be easily seen from the outside, because every mechanism that made the empire strong externally also created pressure internally. Centralization ensured control, but also created dependency on a narrow political core. Strict succession systems prevented open civil war, but intensified internal rivalry. Absolute authority maintained order, but increased the stakes of political survival at the highest level. Over time, these strengths began to interact with one another in complex and unstable ways. Power became concentrated in fewer hands, decisions became more sensitive to perception, and political survival became increasingly tied to shifting interpretations of loyalty, competence, and alignment with the center. In such an environment, even successful governance could generate tension, because success elevated visibility, and visibility increased scrutiny. The empire did not weaken because it stopped functioning. It weakened because it functioned at such an intense level of control that every internal adjustment carried amplified consequences. At the same time, its scale created unavoidable distance between the center and the periphery. Provinces were vast. Communication was slow by necessity. Local realities often diverged from imperial expectations. To maintain unity across such a system required constant correction, reinforcement, and recalibration, and that constant effort created strain. Within the court, within administration, and within the broader governing structure. This produced a paradox. The empire was simultaneously expanding outward and tightening inward. Externally, it projected confidence, power, and coherence. Internally, it required continuous management of competing interests, ambitions, and interpretations of authority. This duality did not cause immediate collapse. Empires rarely fall in moments. Instead, they evolve under pressure, adjusting structures, redistributing power, and redefining stability as conditions change. But every adjustment carries cost, and over time, those costs accumulate beneath the surface of apparent strength. What makes such systems remarkable is not that they fail suddenly, but that they endure as long as they do despite internal contradiction. And in the Ottoman case, this endurance became part of its identity. A state powerful enough to dominate continents, yet complex enough that its greatest challenge was never only outside its borders. It was inside its own architecture of power. Empires rarely fall in a single moment. They unravel slowly, while still believing they are whole. And sometimes, the most dangerous collapse is the one that begins quietly, from within. 1922, after more than 6 centuries of power, conquest, and survival, one of the greatest empires in human history simply ceased to exist. No longer would Ottoman sultans rule from Istanbul. No longer would the empire that once terrified Europe command 3 continents. The Ottoman Empire is dead. But what killed it? An empire that survived wars, revolutions, and centuries of bloodshed did not fall in a single moment. It did not collapse overnight. It was broken piece by piece, inside its own walls, by corruption no throne could control, by enemies it could no longer outrun, and by a world that had already moved on without it. To understand its death, we must go back to the moment it first began to fracture. Chapter 1. The Empire that seemed eternal. At its height, the Ottoman Empire was not just a state. It was a system that connected continents, from the gates of Vienna to the deserts of Arabia, from the Black Sea to the edges of North Africa. Its authority stretched across one of the most strategically valuable regions on Earth. Trade routes flowed through its territory like arteries, carrying wealth, ideas, and power. For centuries, it had expanded with a rhythm that felt almost inevitable. Borders shifted outward, cities changed hands, and each generation of rulers inherited an empire that seemed structurally designed to endure. Inside Istanbul, power projected confidence. The court operated as the political and symbolic center of a world order that few could challenge. The bureaucracy was vast, disciplined, and deeply embedded in daily governance. Taxes were collected, provinces were managed, and armies were mobilized across immense distances with a level of coordination that impressed even European observers. But perhaps the most dangerous illusion of all was stability. Because the empire had survived so much, it began to believe it could survive anything. Wars with Persia, conflicts with European kingdoms, naval confrontations in the Mediterranean. Each crisis reinforced the same belief. The system holds. Even when enemies grew stronger, even when borders were tested, the empire adapted just enough to continue forward. Yet adaptation has a limit when it becomes reactive instead of structural. While the Ottomans preserved traditions that once guaranteed control, the outside world was transforming at a different speed. Europe was entering an age of industrial expansion, centralized nation-states, and technological warfare. Power was no longer measured only by territory, but by production, innovation, and financial systems. And inside the empire, those shifts were not fully understood. What looked like continuity from the outside was, internally, a slow accumulation of strain, administrative delays, uneven authority across provinces, and growing distance between the center and its peripheries. Still, none of this felt like collapse. Empires of this scale do not feel fragile while they are still functioning. They feel permanent, like geography itself. But permanence is often an illusion created by momentum. And momentum, no matter how powerful, always begins to slow before it stops. The Ottoman Empire was still expanding in memory, still respected in diplomacy, still feared in reputation. But beneath that surface, the first structural weaknesses were already forming, quiet, invisible, and irreversible. And they would soon begin to show. Chapter 2: When Power Refused to Change. There is a point in every empire's history when its greatest enemy is no longer outside its borders. It is inside its institutions. For the Ottoman Empire, that moment arrived not with a single disaster, but with a dangerous realization. The systems that once made it powerful were no longer producing strength. They were preserving survival at the cost of progress. The empire had built its dominance on discipline, hierarchy, and a military administrative structure that rewarded loyalty and control. For centuries, this formula worked. It conquered, expanded, and stabilized vast territories through a carefully balanced chain of authority. But over time, that balance hardened into rigidity. The most critical example of this transformation was the Janissary Corps. Once an elite military force feared across continents, it gradually shifted from battlefield excellence to political influence. Instead of serving the state as an instrument of war, it began shaping the state itself. Reforms were resisted, commanders were challenged, and military innovation was often blocked to protect internal privilege. What had once been an engine of conquest became a barrier to modernization. And while internal resistance to change intensified, the external world was accelerating. European powers were reorganizing themselves around new models of governance and warfare. Standing armies were becoming technologically advanced. Industrial capacity was redefining military strength. Administrative systems were becoming more centralized, more efficient, and more adaptable to rapid change. The Ottomans, by contrast, were often trapped in cycles of reform and reversal. Attempts to modernize were introduced, debated, and frequently diluted by internal opposition. Each reform effort created tension between tradition and necessity, and that tension rarely resolved cleanly. As a result, the empire began to develop a dangerous pattern. It could recognize its weaknesses, but it could not consistently overcome them. This is one of the most overlooked stages in imperial decline. Not sudden collapse, but chronic hesitation. A state that knows it must change, but cannot agree on how. Over time, hesitation becomes structural. Decisions slow down. Authority fragments. Competing interests within the system begin to pull in different directions. What was once a unified imperial mechanism starts behaving like a collection of competing power centers. And in that environment, even small failures begin to accumulate. Not loudly, not dramatically, but steadily. The empire was still powerful on paper. Its name still commanded respect. Its history still created fear. But power that cannot evolve eventually becomes power that cannot sustain itself. And while the world outside was moving faster, the empire inside was beginning to stall. Chapter 3: The Invisible Collapse of Wealth. The fall of empires rarely begins with armies. It begins with money. Because before borders shift and capitals fall, something far more dangerous happens quietly. An empire loses control over the system that sustains its power. For the Ottoman Empire, this shift did not arrive as a single financial crisis. It came as a slow erosion of economic relevance in a world that was changing its center of gravity. For centuries, the empire had thrived on controlling key trade routes between East and West. Caravans, spices, silk, and precious goods passed through its territories, generating wealth and reinforcing its strategic importance. Geography itself had once been its greatest economic advantage, but geography does not remain valuable forever. As European maritime powers expanded their naval reach, global trade routes began to bypass the Ottoman-controlled land corridors. Ocean-based commerce became faster, cheaper, and more efficient. Wealth that once flowed through Ottoman cities began to flow around them instead. This shift did not immediately destroy the empire's finances, but it quietly altered its foundation. Revenue patterns changed, commercial dominance weakened, and the empire, still structured around older economic assumptions, struggled to fully adapt to a system it no longer controlled. At the same time, internal financial pressure began to rise. Maintaining a vast empire required constant funding, administration, military upkeep, provincial governance, and infrastructure. But as income structures became less predictable, the gap between expenditure and revenue widened. To manage this imbalance, the state increasingly relied on external financial arrangements, including loans and agreements that gradually reduced economic independence. This is where decline becomes particularly dangerous, when survival depends on compromise. Every financial compromise carried long-term consequences. Short-term stability was preserved, but structural dependency grew stronger. Over time, economic decision-making was no longer entirely autonomous, and autonomy, once weakened, is difficult to restore. Inside the empire, these changes were not always visible in daily life. Markets still operated, cities still functioned, trade still existed. But beneath the surface, the system was becoming less self-sufficient and more externally influenced. What had once been a self-contained economic engine was slowly turning into a dependent structure within a global system it no longer shaped. And as economic control weakened, every other pillar of imperial strength began to feel the impact. Because no empire can maintain political authority, military stability, or territorial unity without financial control at its core. And by the time this reality became fully visible, the imbalance had already grown too large to reverse. Chapter 4. When loyalty began to break. There is a moment in the life of every empire when its people stop seeing themselves as subjects and start seeing themselves as nations. For the Ottoman Empire, that moment did not arrive suddenly. It emerged slowly, across provinces that had once been bound together by a shared imperial structure rather than a shared identity. For centuries, the empire had governed an extraordinary diversity of ethnicities, languages, and religions under a single administrative framework. What held it together was not nationalism, but hierarchy. Loyalty was directed upward, to the sultan and the imperial system, rather than sideways toward ethnic or regional identity. But ideas do not stay still. Across Europe, a new political force was spreading: nationalism. The belief that people who share language, culture, and history should govern themselves was becoming one of the most powerful ideological currents of the modern era. And like all powerful ideas, it did not respect borders. Within the Ottoman territories, these concepts began to circulate through education, trade, migration, and contact with European intellectual movements. At first, they were limited to small groups of thinkers and reformers, But over time, they grew into broader political consciousness. Communities that had once defined themselves primarily through religion or local affiliation began to reinterpret their identity through a national lens. Greeks, Serbs, Bulgarians, Arabs, each group began to imagine a future that was no longer centered on imperial unity, but on independent statehood. This shift did not immediately destroy the empire, but it fundamentally changed its internal stability. Because empires depend not only on control, but on acceptance. When subjects begin to question why they are governed by a distant center, administrative authority alone is no longer enough to hold the system together. Military presence can enforce order, but it cannot manufacture belonging. And once belonging weakens, loyalty becomes conditional. Revolts began to appear in different regions, not always coordinated, but increasingly frequent. Some were suppressed, others led to concessions. Each response created a precedent, and each precedent signaled a growing vulnerability. At the same time, external powers recognized an opportunity. European states began to support nationalist movements strategically, using internal divisions as a tool of geopolitical pressure. What started as ideological change was gradually transformed into a mechanism of international influence. Inside the empire, this created a new and complex reality. Internal fragmentation combined with external manipulation. The result was not immediate collapse, but persistent instability. Territories remained under formal control, but emotional and political unity was weakening. The empire was still mapped as a single entity, yet functionally it was becoming a collection of regions with diverging aspirations. And once an empire reaches that stage, it is no longer held together by unity, only by pressure. Chapter 5: The Empire. Everyone planned to divide. An empire does not fall in isolation. It falls when the world around it begins to prepare for its absence. By the 19th century, the Ottoman Empire was no longer viewed by major European powers as a permanent fixture of global order. It had become something far more dangerous to its survival, a shared strategic problem with a foreseeable ending. And once that perception takes hold, diplomacy quietly shifts into preparation. Russia, Britain, France, and Austria-Hungary were no longer dealing with the Ottoman Empire as an equal competitor. They were engaging with it as an aging structure whose territories, influence, and strategic corridors would eventually need to be redistributed. This was not a single conspiracy. It was a convergence of interests. Each power had its own objectives. Russia looked southward for access to warm water routes. Britain prioritized control of trade pathways to India. France expanded its influence across North Africa. Austria-Hungary monitored the Balkans with increasing anxiety. The Ottoman Empire stood in the center of all these ambitions, not as a threat, but as a contested space. And contested spaces rarely remain intact. One of the clearest signals of this shifting balance came during the Crimean War, when European alliances temporarily formed not to strengthen the Ottomans, but to prevent any single power from inheriting their collapse too early. The empire was still useful, but no longer self-sustaining. It had become a buffer, a managed weakness, a structure kept alive not because it was strong, but because its immediate removal would destabilize the broader system of European power politics. This is one of the most revealing stages in imperial decline, when survival depends on external interest. Because once other powers begin to manage your stability, they also begin to manage your future. Inside the empire, this external pressure translated into constant diplomatic negotiation, territorial compromise, and incremental loss of autonomy. Provinces became bargaining chips. Reforms were often influenced or constrained by foreign expectations. Even internal decisions were increasingly made with external reactions in mind. At the same time, nationalist movements within the empire were no longer purely internal phenomena. They were now indirectly shaped, supported, or accelerated by external actors who saw strategic value in fragmentation. The empire was no longer dealing with isolated challenges. It was facing a coordinated environment of pressures, some direct, some indirect, but all converging toward the same outcome: gradual reduction of imperial control. And as the 19th century progressed, one phrase began to circulate in European political discourse to describe it: the sick man of Europe. It was not just a label, it was a diagnosis, and more importantly, it was a forecast. Chapter 6: The Empire's Final Attempt to Save Itself. Empires rarely accept death quietly. They fight it through reform, through force, and through desperate attempts to rebuild what has already begun to decay. By the early 20th century, the Ottoman Empire understood a painful truth: survival required transformation. The world it once dominated no longer existed. Industrialized Europe had changed the rules of power, and internal fragmentation had already weakened imperial unity. The question was no longer whether reform was necessary. It was whether reform had come too late. This urgency gave rise to one of the most critical political movements in Ottoman history: the Young Turks. They were not a single unified group, but a coalition of officers, intellectuals, and bureaucrats who believed the empire could still be saved if it was rebuilt from within. Their vision was rooted in modernization, constitutional governance, administrative restructuring, and military reform designed to restore efficiency and central control. In 1908, their influence culminated in the restoration of a constitutional system, a moment that briefly created hope across parts of the empire. For a short period, it appeared that a new political era might emerge, one capable of aligning the empire with the modern world. But reform in a collapsing system is never purely technical. It is political, and politics inside a weakening empire is rarely stable. The introduction of constitutional governance did not resolve internal divisions. Instead, it exposed them more clearly. Competing factions emerged within the ruling structure. Authority became fragmented between traditional institutions and reformist groups. Instead of unifying the empire, modernization efforts often intensified internal conflict. The military, once the backbone of imperial stability, also became politically entangled. Officers aligned with different ideological visions, and loyalty increasingly shifted from institutions to movements. This created a fragile environment where decisions were influenced as much by internal power struggles as by external threats. At the same time, the empire's geopolitical situation continued to deteriorate. Territorial losses, regional uprisings, and diplomatic pressure did not slow down. In many cases, they accelerated. What the Young Turks attempted was not simply reform, it was compression, a race to modernize an empire that was simultaneously shrinking, fragmenting, and being pressured from multiple directions. But timing defines outcomes more than intention. And by this stage, every reform effort carried a heavy contradiction. It required stability to succeed, yet it was being implemented in a system already destabilized. The result was a cycle of urgency without resolution. Each attempt to strengthen the empire revealed deeper weaknesses. Each reform exposed more resistance. Each political shift created new fractures within the system itself. And as internal divisions deepened, a far larger conflict was approaching on the global stage. One that would not test the empire's ability to reform, but its ability to survive at all. Chapter 7: The War That Ended Everything. There are wars that reshape borders, and then there are wars that erase empires. When World War I erupted in 1914, the Ottoman Empire did not enter as a dominant power or a confident participant. It entered as a weakened state, making a final, irreversible gamble, hoping alignment would preserve what isolation could no longer protect. It was a decision driven not by strength, but by necessity. And once that decision was made, the empire found itself pulled into a conflict far beyond its capacity to control. What followed was not a single battlefield failure, but a multi-front collapse unfolding across continents. In the Middle East, Ottoman forces were stretched across vast deserts, facing coordinated campaigns and local uprisings. In the Caucasus, harsh terrain and relentless pressure drained already limited resources. In Europe, remaining territories were squeezed under constant military strain. But perhaps the most destabilizing development came from within its own regions. Arab territories, long part of the imperial structure, began to break away under the influence of nationalist movements and external support. The Arab Revolt did not just reduce territory, it shattered the illusion of internal unity at a critical moment in the war. Simultaneously, the empire's logistical and economic systems were pushed beyond their limits. Supply chains weakened. Communication across fronts became inconsistent. Military coordination suffered under the weight of a global war that demanded more than the empire could realistically provide. As the war progressed, losses accumulated faster than they could be absorbed. Cities changed control, armies were exhausted, resources disappeared, and with each setback, the empire's negotiating position in the world weakened further. By the time the war ended in 1918, the Ottoman Empire was no longer a contender in global politics. It was a defeated structure awaiting external decisions about its future. The post-war settlement did not preserve what remained of its authority. Instead, it formalized its dissolution. Territories were divided, influence was redistributed, and the imperial system that had lasted for centuries was systematically dismantled. In 1922, the final symbolic institution, the Sultanate, was abolished, and with it, the Ottoman Empire ceased to exist. But the end of the empire was not the end of the story, because empires do not disappear without leaving consequences behind. They leave new borders, new tensions, and new nations shaped by the ruins of what came before. Among those who rose from the collapse was a figure who would redefine the region's future, Mustafa Kemal Ataturk, who would go on to establish modern Turkey, built on the foundations of a broken empire and a radically new vision of statehood. The Ottoman Empire was gone, but its shadow had only begun to reshape the modern world. The Ottoman Empire ended in 1922, but its echoes never truly faded. From its ruins rose new nations, new borders, and new conflicts that still shape our world today. Because some empires don't disappear, they transform history itself.